A very interesting day in day number 5 for the Karen Reed trial. We had 2 witnesses that took up most of the day. All the way at the end of the day, there was another sergeant, Sergeant Lank, who was questioned not in front of the jury. And we're going to discuss that later on in the video. But first, let's discuss the 2 witnesses that took up most of the day today. So we had Paul Gallagher. Paul Gallagher was the lieutenant. He is a lieutenant at the Canton Police Department. Now, he was the ranking officer who came to that scene, and he was directing how to preserve this scene and to collect certain evidence, which we're going to find is very interesting. So one of the things that he used, which was a novel idea, was to use a leaf blower. So the conditions were blizzardy, there's snow falling, and they were trying to figure out the area of the scene and see if there's any evidence to be collected. So he decided on an idea to get a leaf blower. So he actually got a leaf blower. He sent the other sergeant who was there at the time, Sergeant Good, and he went and got his own leaf blower, and they were using the leaf blower to clear the area and look for evidence, which was right away strikes you as not exactly the greatest way to preserve evidence and look through a crime scene. But again, they are in the middle of a blizzard, snow is falling down, and they got to come up with something. Now, a tent was suggested at some point. They don't think a tent would have worked to protect the area, preserve the area, and therefore they decided that the best course of action would be to use a leaf blower. All right, so he's using a leaf blower, and they're taking photographs of the area. They're looking at some of the area on the snow, which looks like there's some blood and a cocktail glass. So he does say that he had a tent in his car. So he had a tent in his car, and therefore he didn't need to go to the police station to get a tent. Right? You want to set up a tent over the area so that no snow will blow into it. But, of course, a tent is only a makeshift tent, and if there's a lot of winds, snow can get underneath, and the question is whether it's going to be effective at all. But he did say that he did not need to go to the Canton Police Department to get a tent because he already had a tent in his car, his own personal tent, I guess. So he also testified that there was no footprints from the house to John O'Keefe's body. He, like we said, he discovered the cocktail glass near his body. He took some of the glass samples with him for evidence, and he took some blood samples. He eventually did go into the kitchen of 34 Fairview, so he was in the house. He also then talks about the Karen Reed's Lexus car, which was taken to what they called a Sally port, which is where they looked at the car for evidence, looked at the taillight, removed the taillight, and did some other investigation regarding the car. And finally, he testified that he doesn't really know Trooper Proctor, and that's going to be important in this case. Who exactly does Michael Proctor, the trooper who was investigating this case, who exactly does he know? And he was saying he doesn't really know him. Now, cross-examination was very interesting on this specific Lieutenant Paul Gallagher. First of all, he says that Trooper Proctor actually, this comes out on cross-examination, Trooper Proctor did not even conduct any interview with Paul Gallagher. Isn't that interesting? This is a ranking lieutenant, a ranking officer on scene who's conducting the collection of the evidence and using this leaf blower and collecting the evidence, bringing it back to the police station, and he was never even interviewed by Michael Proctor. Isn't that interesting? Actually, no one from the DA's office even interviewed him until April 2024, and now here he is in trial. So what is going on? Why are they not doing what you would consider a thorough investigation and investigating and talking to the people who are actually at the scene collecting evidence? That's a good point that the defense brought out. He never wrote a report about what he did or his observations. Also very interesting. Maybe he put that off onto somebody else to do, which we have yet to see, but he said he did not write a report about what he did, what he observed. Also, another point that they brought out is that they did not use really exact measurements to determine where exactly everything is located. There are ways to use different coordinates to map out exactly where you're finding the cocktail, where the bloodstains are, and they didn't do it. They just kind of said, yeah, it's near the fire hydrant, near the flagpole on the left side of the lawn, and they didn't really do it in the best possible way. That's another thing that they brought out. Also, another interesting fact is that this lieutenant, even though he was been experienced for many, many, many years, I think something like 30 years, he never had to process or preserve a crime scene in the snow, which really makes you scratch your head. This is Boston. There is plenty of days where it's snowing, and you would assume that there's some crime. Maybe it's a very light crime area, and therefore they're not dealing with crime. But that's what he testified, that they've never had to preserve a crime scene in the snow, which is just fantastic for a place like Boston in this area. It must be a very, very low crime rate in this area, according to what he's saying. Now, another thing that was brought out, he asked him, did you know that Sergeant Lank, who we're probably going to be hearing about to next day's trial, day number 6, Sergeant Lank actually was very friendly with Chris Albert from the Albert family. And we know that there's going to be a lot of connections made between the investigators and the Albert family, right? Brian Albert's a police officer, and anybody involved with the Albert family who's friends with the Albert family who also works with the police station probably shouldn't be investigating. Yet Sergeant Link already acknowledged, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit more in the video later on, that Sergeant Link acknowledged that he's good friends with Chris Albert, or he was very good friends with Chris Albert. They're still very friendly. And Sergeant Link was the one who was taking statements from the Albert family. So that is not exactly a great look right there. And he asked, this is what the defense attorney asked the lieutenant, Paul Gallagher, on the stand. Do you think that there's a problem there? The fact that Sergeant Link is the one taking statements from the Albert family when he is going to admit and acknowledge that he is close friends with at least one of the Alberts, Chris Albert. And this is what his response was. No, I don't see any problem with that. And he said it as, no, not Sergeant Lank, meaning Sergeant Lank is above all this. There's no way that he would do anything different than just act honorably as a police officer should, even if it's his friend. He would absolutely not do anything. And that's kind of what he was suggesting in his answer by saying, no, not Sergeant Lank. Sergeant Lank is above all of this. He would only act honorably. So that is what he answered. Okay, now this is going to come back, and I think that the defense attorney could have made a bigger deal about this later on. He could have made a big deal about it now, but he could have made, later on in his testimony, he's going to say things which can really open up some pretty strong lines of cross-examination, which we're going to talk about soon. So he continued on, and he said, did you tell another lieutenant who wrote a report about what you told him, did you tell him that you actually went to the police station to get a tent? Because apparently in this Lieutenant Tully, his report, he writes that you said that you went to the police station, the Canton Police Department, to get a tent, and not that you actually had a tent in your car already, which is what you testified to a minute ago. So what was interesting also, I think, if you were watching this trial, or if you want to rewatch this specific part, is how the defense attorney deals with the answer that the lieutenant gives him. And this is something that's important as an attorney, because sometimes you're asking a specific question and the answer doesn't really answer your specific question. It answers a different type of question, and a lot of attorneys will just move on and not realize that the answer doesn't really actually answer the question that you were asking. So the question was, do you remember telling Lieutenant Tully, or did you actually tell Lieutenant Tully that you went to the Canton Police Headquarters to get the tent to protect the area where John O'Keefe's body was from the falling snow? But you decided not to use the tent because the winds were just too crazy. And his response to that was, we didn't have a tent at that time. Right? So that technically kind of answers the question. Yeah, well, we didn't have a tent in that time. But no, it actually doesn't, because that wasn't his question. His question was, did you tell that to Lieutenant Tully or not? And now you're saying something different. And if I can show that you said something different than what you're testifying now, it looks like you're a liar. So you have a good point here, and this is what the defense attorney did. He didn't get thrown off by this answer. He actually stayed on point. And he said, that wasn't my question. My question wasn't whether the Canton Police Department has a tent or not. That wasn't my question. My question was, did you tell Lieutenant Tully that you went back to the Canton Police Department to get a tent, but it wasn't going to help anyway? Did you tell that? Did you say that or not? Is somebody making stuff up here? That's essentially what I'm asking. And he said, no, I did not tell that to Lieutenant Tully. Okay, great. That's great for the defense attorney, because now they're going to say, okay, great, so Lieutenant Tully's a liar, right? Or he wrote something wrong in his report. That's all they needed, and that's good. So that's what he said. That wasn't my question. Sometimes, by the way, in my trials, when I'm having this type of back and forth with a witness, when I'm nice, I'll say something that wasn't my question. But sometimes I'll say, excuse me, what question are you answering? And usually they'll say, your question. And then I'll say, what was my question? And then they'll either get it right or get it wrong. And then I'll say, right. So how does your answer my question? So just, to show them how they're trying to be evasive, you could draw it out and make them look a little more stupid on the stand. I think what the defense attorney did here was great. All right, moving on. Now, he said, also he brought out that you testified that there was no steps, no footprints from the house to John O'Keefe's body, which would suggest that there was nothing to do with anything that happened in the house and that was related to John O'Keefe's death or murder here. Yet he established that even if there were footsteps earlier, the way that it was snowing would have covered up all the footsteps, right? I mean, this is hours of blizzarding. Then it's very understandable that there would be no visible footprints if this already happened hours ago. All right, so he brought that out. Also, he said the point about a leaf blower, right? You never used a leaf blower before an investigation, right? I mean, that sounds really crazy. Doesn't sound normal to use a leaf blower when you're trying to preserve a crime scene. And he acknowledged, yeah, I never used a leaf blower before to preserve a crime scene. Now, here's a very, very interesting part. I thought this was just, wow, unbelievable. And I'm certainly, this slide would absolutely make it to my closing argument. All right, they had a picture of what this lieutenant used to gather the evidence. And the evidence of blood droppings in the snow. And this is what he used. He borrowed these Solo plastic red cups from a neighbor's house to collect this droplets of blood in the snow. And they actually have a picture of 6 of these cups. I think it's 6 of these red cups in the police station in a brown paper bag. Not even a brown evidence bag. It's just like some brown, maybe Stop and Shop bag. Brown paper bag. And it's just sitting there. It's like, is this how you preserve evidence? This is blood. This can be very, very easily contaminated if this is how you collect this type of blood. And that's how he collected it. So they brought out a good point saying that this is how you collect it. And he actually even threw in a line. He's like, you mean the same type of cup that you drink beer at a barbecue? And of course that elicited an objection. And the judge actually said, I'm going to allow it. I'm going to allow this type of question because it's true. This is the type of cup that you drink from at a barbecue that's lying around the floor that people, it's a plastic cup. So it was very mind-blowing that actually this is how they use. Now, he said that they have no equipment to gather blood, otherwise, in a way, in a safe and sanitary way, which sounds a little bit nuts. How can a police department not have a way to collect samples of blood in a sanitary, clean way? And you're going to say that, well, we don't deal with homicides. And that also came out that once it's a homicide, it gets transferred to the state police, right? The state comes in when it's a homicide, but the Canton Police Department, they don't really deal with homicides. Okay, but do you deal with assault and batteries? Do you ever deal with gunshot wounds? Do you ever deal with anything that has blood with it that you may need to collect as evidence? And it's snowing a lot of times in Boston, so you never have to deal with any of that type of crime, and where you have to collect some type of blood on the snow. This wasn't brought out. I think it could have been. But, I mean, it's just wild. It's just wild that you don't really have any sort of equipment to be able to collect evidence in a safe and sanitary way, and you have to resort to borrowing red plastic cups from a neighbor. I mean, it just sounds absolutely nuts. All right, well, that was what the testimony said. Now, he also, the testimony came out. Now, also, he said that he assumed that Sergeant Link, which has close ties to the Albert family, which we're going to hear about later, he has no idea exactly what Sergeant Link did with the cups. He assumed that he did exactly what he said he did, but he didn't observe Sergeant Link exactly place the cups or follow where that chain of custody went. He just assumed that Sergeant Link did what he was supposed to do with the cups, and they have a temporary evidence area where they keep the temporary evidence, and then once this turned into homicide, then the state took over that evidence. However, the report says that he booked these red cups with some blood in them, collected from the scene, into temporary evidence, but there's no log. There's no log that we are booking these red cups. There should be a log when you're booking evidence, and there's no log about that. And this evidence was there for 3 days before the state police took over the evidence. So there's no log about what happened with this blood. Did anybody tamper with the blood? There's no log in, out. Did anybody move it? Did anybody insert more blood and more evidence? Is it tampered with? There's no log. So there's nothing to go on. Just by Sergeant Lank saying, yeah, this is what I did. Now, we didn't hear from Sergeant Lank yet. So this is a little bit speculation, but this is what we're getting, at least from Lieutenant Paul Gallagher. All right. Now, he also acknowledged that he never saw a baseball hat or a shoe or any pieces of taillight, which is going to be significant also, that all of these police officers didn't see any signs of any sort of taillight. And officially, there's 43 broken pieces of taillight somewhere around that area. And no one saw even one piece of this taillight. That's a significant point. So they keep bringing that out, and that's a good move. And nobody saw the baseball hat, and nobody saw the shoe. Now, here's also, this is also a very interesting line of cross-examination. He said something about, did you search the house, right? This is a house in front of the Albert's house. Did you search the house? And then he said very strongly, and anytime that you see that a police officer or anybody on the witness stand is being very strong about something, it means that they know this question's coming and they've thought about how to answer it, and they decided it's going to be answered very strongly. And this is what he answered it. He said, no, because there's no probable cause. You know as good as I do that you have to have probable cause to search a house. And therefore, he said, this is what he said in his testimony, that there was no probable cause and we need a warrant to search that house. And he said, I knew that there's no probable cause, period. Very strongly. I know there's no probable cause, so why even waste my time? Now, he did bring out, the defense attorney, this is Alan Jackson, he brought out, well, did you even try? You got a dead person in the middle of the lawn, someone's house. Did you even try? He's like, no, because I knew there's no probable cause. He said, well, did you ask for consent? Why didn't you ask for consent? This is a police officer. After all, Brian Albert is a police officer. Wouldn't you think he's trying to help? And he understands. Why don't you ask him for consent? Let's just search your house. Give us consent. Don't make us go through going through a judge and getting a search warrant. Just consent. If you're completely as pure as the fallen snow, well then, let us search your house. Why didn't you ask them consent? He said, no, I didn't ask for consent. And also, just another line, which I think could have been brought out, is, so hold on a second. You're telling me that you know for a fact, certainly, that there's no probable cause. There cannot be any probable cause that exists to be able to search this house, right? So you're telling me, when you have people in the house that invite an individual to come to a party at their house at night, and the next thing that you know, that person is found dead in front of their house, and you have somebody, Karen Reed in this case, saying that person actually went into the house and was murdered there, you still don't have probable cause to search that house. Is that what you're telling me? Really? That's really interesting. All right. Well, anyway, and even if you want to take the Karen Reed part out and just say, this is a person who was invited to this house for an after party and then was found dead in front of their house. That's not probable cause to be able to search that house? Really? All right. Well, they didn't specifically ask that, but I think it was enough brought out that he didn't try, he didn't ask for consent, and that was it. All right. Now, he does also talk about some conversations that he had with Chief Berkowitz. Chief Berkowitz was the chief of that Canton Police Department, and he had some discussions. This is Lieutenant Paul Gallagher. He had discussions with him that, there may be an appearance of a conflict of interest here. Why? Because there is an investigator, Kevin Albert, who works for the Canton Police Department, and Brian Albert is his brother. So certainly looks like a reason to recuse themselves from the investigation. So he actually said that I even brought that point out to Chief Berkowitz. Nevertheless, he went back to 34 Fairview at 9 a.m. and conducted some interviews with Sergeant Lank. And he also knew that Sergeant Lank did speak to some of those people in the house before that second interview. So he came back in the morning at about 9 a.m. to 34 Fairview to interview some of the people in the house. Before that, Sergeant Lank actually did already speak to some of the people in the house. And of course, none of this is written in any report. So that's a problem, right? So he brought that out also. None of this first interview wasn't recorded, wasn't put down into a report, at least from what we see now. Then he asked, do you know if there's anybody else in the house besides Jennifer McCabe and Brian Albert? Were there other 3 or 4 people in the house at the time? He said he didn't know, and he didn't think that it was important at that time, which is, again, he didn't think it was important to know who's in that house at the time when someone's dead in front of that person's house. It's not the greatest answers. Now, he said that he is very close with Brian Higgins. Brian Higgins actually works. He's an ATF agent that works he has an office in the Canton Police Department. So, of course, he knows him. So he's close with him. But he can't tell for sure whether Brian Higgins was one of the people in the house or not. Another point that they brought out was Brian Higgins does have access to that vehicle. So when they brought the vehicle, Karen Reed's vehicle, the Lexus, into the Canton Police Department, into that garage area, Brian Higgins had access to that vehicle. So that's another part that he brought out. Only Jennifer McCabe was interviewed, nobody else from the house. He brought that out. It was called the Sally Port. Sorry if I called it the garage. The Sally Port, that's what they referred to it. Now, another interesting point that they brought out said, did you photograph that car, Karen Reed's Lexus, when it came into the Sally Port the first time? And this would be very important to do to make sure that this is how it looked when it came in, and this is what we did, and this is how it looks when it came out. So that's what you want to do. If you're a police department, as soon as some evidence comes in, you take a picture of it and make sure that there's be no claims that anything was tampered with. But they didn't do that. They didn't take pictures of the car as soon as it came in. So how do we know who tampered with what in that police department? And he has no idea about whether it was tampered with. Now, he also said, he brought this point out. You had a conversation. This is the same lieutenant. You had a conversation with your chief, Chief Berkowitz, saying that there may be a conflict with the Canton Police Department. Yet, you, Lieutenant, call a Canton Police Department police officer to take off the taillight. Right? They had a Canton Police Department police officer taking off the taillight. Apparently, they needed to take off the entire taillight for evidence purposes. Maybe there's something embedded in that taillight. So you're the one that said there may be a conflict of interest here, right? You're the one that said that. You're the one that brought it up to Chief Berkowitz, and then you yourself go and call a Canton Police Department officer to take off the taillight of this vehicle. So he brought this point out also. That's a good point. And then he tried to explain his position. This is Lieutenant Gallagher tried to explain his position, saying, no. Hold on a minute. I didn't really mean that there's a complete conflict with the entire police department and we can't do anything on the case. All I meant was that in terms of conducting the interviews of the Albert family, that may be a conflict of interest. And he said, that's not really a conflict of interest either, because Kevin Albert is not the one who's conducting the interviews. If Kevin Albert was the one who's conducting the interviews, then 100%, that's a conflict of interest. But here, if we have somebody else from the police department conducting the interviews, it's not really a conflict of interest. It's a different police officer. So why should that be a problem? Now, it happens to be that the police officer who did it was Sergeant Lake, who's very close with Chris Albert. Okay, let's put that aside. But technically, it's not a conflict of interest. And still, because of the appearance of a conflict of interest, that's what I was telling the chief of police. And we know, as attorneys, if you watch these trials, that even the appearance of impropriety or the appearance of a conflict of interest, we don't want to have anybody even think that. And that's why the attorneys never say a word, even a good morning to the jurors. That's part of the jury instructions. We don't even want to have the appearance of impropriety. And therefore we dot all our T's and dot all our I's and cross all our T's. So that's all. So what he's trying to explain, the lieutenant is trying to explain that I was just telling Chief Berkowitz that because of this appearance of a conflict of interest, maybe we should not be conducting the actual interviews. But of course, anything else that's involved in the case, that assuming that Kevin Albert is not the one who's actually doing it, and this is not even one of his roles that he does, so then it would be 100% fine. That's technically what his response is. Now, I think what could have been just brought out a little bit more is that you're telling me, this was not brought out, but I think it could have been brought out, that you're telling me that even the appearance of a conflict of interest you're concerned about, yet you had no problem with Sergeant Link, who you said before I asked you, do you see any problem at all with Sergeant Link conducting these interviews with the Alberts family when he's very close, as a close friend of Chris Albert? And you told me that you have no problem. No, it's not Sergeant Link. Sergeant Link is above all of this. He would only act honorably. But hold on, what about the appearance? Don't you agree with me that the appearance, even the appearance of a conflict of interest, should be avoided? So now, do you have a problem with Sergeant Link conducting those interviews or not? So here's where you could have really caught the lieutenant in a little bit more of a pickle. Okay? Again, I think the point really it was brought out, but I think it could have been slammed home a little bit more with this line of questioning. All right. So now what was interesting is that at one point, the lieutenant said that by removing the taillight, it did cause the taillight to break a little bit. And then he completely changed and said, no, it didn't. And then a redirect, he also said that, no, it didn't break at all. But if you look at the transcript, I mean, when I was seeing it the first time, he said, yeah, it did. And then he walked that back. And then you also saw some pictures of the vehicle in the Sally Port. You see a rag on the floor, and then you see the pictures of this blood that was gathered in these red cups, and it's right next to the car. They're taking a picture of this right next to the car. Now that's where it was for the picture. So yeah, during the picture, he's saying, yeah, well, that's far away from the car. But what happened when when they stopped taking the picture? Who knows where that blood in these cups that were in this brown paper bag? Who knows where that went then? So it just looks really, really sloppy. All right. So that's essentially what happened with the Paul Gallagher on the stand. Then we had Sergeant Shawn Good. Shawn Good was doing the dispatch that night. He was in the office in the police department that morning. He took the phone calls, and they played the phone calls, the police calls from Carrie Roberts and Jennifer McCabe. So they played those, and then he eventually had somebody take him over so that he can go to the scene himself. And he went to the scene. He spoke to Jennifer McCabe. He spoke to Carrie Roberts. Spoke to Karen Reed. He asked Karen Reed what happened here. She said that she doesn't have any idea about how John ended up there. So that also was very interesting why he would say that. No one said that yet, but that's coming out right now that when he asked Karen Reed what happened, Karen Reed couldn't tell him how John O'Keefe could have ended up there. And eventually she did make suicidal comments. So then he sent them home because she was just so beside herself, Karen Reed. She wasn't able to answer any questions. She was just running her off. She was hysterical. And therefore he said to Carrie Roberts, okay, go take her home or get her relaxed, get her warm, and maybe she'll be able to be helpful tomorrow when she calms down. And then right away he told them to come back because she was saying some suicidal comments. And then he said something interesting, which I think something could have been brought out a little bit more with this statement. He said, well, obviously we needed to speak to the homeowners, right? And what he did is he told Jennifer McCabe to go wake up the homeowners. Why? Because he knew that Jennifer McCabe was related to them, and therefore it's a friendly face, and it's not just a random person waking you up at 6 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a blizzard. It's actually a friendly face who's knocking on the door, right? So two things that could have been brought out with this. Number one is that why was it so obvious? Tell me. You just said it's obvious that you need to speak to the homeowners. Tell me, explain a little bit more. Why is it so obvious that you need to speak to the homeowners? I mean, we had Lieutenant Gallagher on the stand just a minute ago who said that he didn't find it at all that there could even be any probable cause to even search that house. So why is it so obvious to you what's so obvious to him that it's not? You guys are obviously have a little bit contradiction. So you could have brought that point out. Now also, he told Jennifer McCabe to go wake up the homeowners. Now, this is not, also probably not a great police protocol to send witnesses to a crime. Again, Jennifer McCabe was one of the people who saw John O'Keefe dead, right? So you don't send witnesses to go get other witnesses. That you have to seclude. You have to keep each witness separate from each other. That's what you're supposed to be doing in a crime scene. You've got to seclude all the witnesses, and you don't send them on these messengers to go knock on doors and get people, because then they can start talking to people. So that could have been brought out. That point could have been brought out. Why are you sending a potential witness to go knock on the door? All right. Well, that's what he said, because it was friendly face. Now, he said that he also spoke to Brian and Nicole Albert, and he said that they looked like they just woke up. That's how they looked. Like they just woke up in the middle of 6 o'clock in the morning. They were probably still in pajamas. I don't know. Maybe they quickly threw in a robe or something or sweatshirt. I don't know. He doesn't say that. But he says they looked like they just honestly just woke up in the middle of the night. Didn't notice anything out of the ordinary in the house. He spent about 20, 25 minutes in the house. And then he also says that, yes, he did get the leaf blower for the lieutenant. For Lieutenant Gallagher, and he also took the videos of Lieutenant Gallagher while Lieutenant Gallagher was actually using the leaf blower. All right. So on the cross-examination for Sergeant Good, they brought out the following. That number one, there's a female named Courtney Proctor. Courtney Proctor was in Sergeant Good's graduating class, who's also Michael Proctor's sister. So you're seeing that there is some sort of connection between Michael Proctor and Sergeant Good. Also, Jill Daniels was in your class, whose sister married Christopher Albert. So there's a connection again to the Albert family there. He's friends with Kevin Albert. Obviously, Kevin Albert is a police detective or police officer, so he's going to have some connection there. Also, he acknowledged that it was the first homicide for the department. The department never dealt with a homicide before, apparently, and it seemed like even involve the state police. So there's been no homicides yet for this area. He did also acknowledge that Brian Higgins is an ATF agent. He has an office in the Canton Police Department for years. So Brian Higgins is very connected with the Canton Police Department. And then he also testified that Brian Higgins came in at 1:30 in the morning. So Brian Higgins all of a sudden shows up at the police department at 1:30 a.m. And this is something that Sergeant Good noticed. And he had no idea why he was there, but he was there at 1:30 in the morning. Now, another point that they brought out is that with all these sirens and all the screaming, everyone's acknowledging that Karen Reed was acting, was hysterical. She was screaming. She was repeating things. There's lights all over the place. All these police officers. There's a fire truck that was there. They had ambulances there, and they didn't have the sirens, but they had all these lights right in front of somebody's house, right in front of a Canton police officer's house. And all the screaming, everything, Brian Albert never came out of the house from all that time. And he never asked Brian Albert why he didn't come out of the house. Did he ever, and then he also spoke to him about, did you ever tell Kevin Albert, because he's a fellow detective of yours, did you ever tell Kevin Albert about your experiences that day? He said yes. Okay, so they did speak about it at some point. And he also brought out that, of course, you guys have a little bit of a brotherhood. You're both police officers. You're going to try to protect each other and have each other's backs and things like that. So he did bring that part out also. Also, he said that he acknowledged that he didn't hear Karen Reed saying that she hit him. He didn't find any pieces of taillight there either. He didn't find any men's hat or shoes. And he also acknowledged that after 2 hours, when at first they did close off the scene, but after 2 hours, the crime scene was completely open to the public. It wasn't sealed off in any sort of way. So anybody in the world could have tampered with that crime scene 2 hours after they were initially there. So that's a problem. Also, another thing that he brought out, which is interesting, is that in the police report, in persons involved, there's a persons involved section in the police report. Now, isn't it interesting that every single person who is involved has the first name and a last name? Yet, there's one person in the report who doesn't clearly have spelled out his first name and last name. Who do you think that person is? Well, it's Brian Albert. So that came out very interesting, don't you think? Very curious. Everybody else in the report is clearly first name, last name, and for some reason, Brian Albert, we'll just quickly put his name in there as small as possible. Interesting observation there. Also, he didn't mention that Colin Albert was present. And also, another interesting thing is that for each witness who was there, they had home addresses listed. So there's a home address listed for each person involved under the persons involved section, except for Brian Higgins. Brian Higgins, they put down the police department. Now, if you're reporting as a police officer for the scene, okay, it's a little bit more understood that, okay, this police officer was there. He's reporting as part of his job, and therefore you can list the police department as his address. But here, Brian Higgins was not reporting as a police officer, and therefore, since he was involved or there or present, so then they should have put down his home address. Why didn't they put down his home address? Are they trying to protect him? So again, you're seeing preferential treatment to people from the police department and Brian Albert. So some issues there. All right. So those were the two witnesses that really took up most of the day. And then all the way at the end of the day, they had Sergeant Lank. And they excused the jury because they wanted to have an offer of proof. So some proffer, and they want to get into, what's the reason for this, is because they want to get into Sergeant Lank's, a situation with Sergeant Lank and Chris Albert. Now, it's going to come out for sure, this is no question, that Sergeant Lank is friends with Chris Albert. That's going to come out, and there's no question about it. The judge doesn't need to have an offer of proof about that. But what does the judge need to have an offer of proof about is that they need the judge has to see how evidence would come in regarding a specific event that happened. Now, what event are we talking about? We're talking about an event where Chris Albert was out at a bar or restaurant, and Sergeant Lank was also there, and they're friends. And what happened was that Sergeant Lank was in his vehicle. This is what came out, that Sergeant Lank was in his vehicle, and Chris Albert came to his vehicle from the bar or the restaurant, and he said that these two people are going after him, are fighting with him, and he needs help. So what happens is Sergeant Lank gets out of the car, and this is where the question about what exactly happened. But what's clear is that there were some punches exchanged between Sergeant Lank and this aggressor, shall we call him. There were names given, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Mark and Alfredo. So these were people that were either starting up with Chris Albert or were victims of Chris Albert. It's not sure. It's not clear from exactly what happened. But Sergeant Lank is going to say that, no, these people were the aggressors. They were trying to, I guess, pick on Chris Albert, and therefore Chris Albert got Sergeant Lank. Sergeant Lank got out of his car, and he was not on patrol. He wasn't on duty, and he came to the aid of Chris Albert, which ended up in a fist fight. And he ended up punching some of these individuals, Mark and Alfredo, I think his name was. And what happened, that's Sergeant Lank's version of the events. Now, what actually happened, I don't know what actually happened, but continuing what happened, is that these people, Mark and Alfredo, came to the police department, the Canton Police Department, the next day. They were handcuffed or something, charged, and with assault. They were like assault that they were charged. And they came to the Canton Police Department to file a complaint against Sergeant Lank, who, according to their version of events, just decided to beat them up for no reason at all. Not that these guys, Mark and Alfredo, were the aggressors, but they were doing nothing. Or maybe they were having some words with Chris, and Sergeant Lank got in the middle of it, and in fact asserted his authority as a police officer. And that's important, because in order to have a civil rights case, you have to be acting in color of state law. You have to be acting within your position as a police officer if you're going to sue that person for civil rights violations. All right. So at their allegations, Mark and Alfredo's allegations against Sergeant Lank were that he was the instigator. He just said that he's a police officer and he's getting involved here, and he was the one that asserted his authority and started beating the crap out of them. And therefore, they wanted to file a complaint against him. They told the Canton Police Department told these people, we're not letting you fill it out today. This is according to their report. We're not letting you fill it out today. Go home and come back later. And during that time, Sergeant Lank and the Canton Police Department apparently filled out police reports about what happened that night, even though it was a few days later. They filled out a claiming that what happened actually was Sergeant Lank was being punched in the face first. He was being punched, and he was also a victim in this case, and he was just responding to him being punched in the face by these people, Mark and Alfredo. And therefore their police report came in first, and then after that, that's when they allowed these people, Mark and Alfredo, to file a complaint. So that is very interesting exactly what happened here. But what happened eventually was actually Mark and Alfredo sued Sergeant Link and the most probably Canton Police Department. Now, I didn't see this complaint, but this is what they're talking about. And it seems that they were suing this police officer for civil rights violations. And on top of that, they met later at a gas station, and what happened at the gas station is also disputed. But apparently what Mark and Alfredo say is that at the police station, the police officer asked them, Sergeant Link asked them, "How you doing, guys?" Like trying to like smirk at them that they're being charged with assault now. And they said, well, actually we're not doing good because you beat us up and now we're getting arrested for your actions. And then he arrested them again for witness intimidation. Now his version of the story is that no, that's actually they came over to him and they were trying to intimidate him, and therefore he arrested them for witness intimidation. So very strange version of events as well. But the bottom line is that these guys, Mark and Alfredo, sued Sergeant Link for violating their civil rights. That's what apparently happened, and that lawsuit was settled. Okay, now what happens in these type of settlements is that there's always a confidentiality agreement. In the settlement, when you settle with somebody, you don't just say, okay, here's a whatever it is, $100,000, here's $1 million, and let's just dismiss the case. That's not what happens. You have to sign a release, and in that release, you can argue about different language that you want in the release. So if I'm going to give you money, you have to release all your liability against me. And one of the things that always happens in these cases is that you have to sign a confidentiality agreement, that you're not going to talk to anybody about what happened here. You're not going to say what the amount is. And, they don't want police officers and police stations and police municipalities to be made fun of or look bad to the public if this gets out. So when there's a settlement, there is usually a confidentiality agreement or provision in that release. And that's what happened here. And that's what kind of also came out through the testimony from Sergeant Link. And this is all, by the way, not in front of the jury because the judge wanted to see whether she's going to allow some of this stuff in to show that how much Sergeant Link is close with Chris Albert, that he would even come to his defense and get into a fist fight with someone, charge them falsely, then get to be the subject of a lawsuit against himself for civil rights violations. This is all for his friend, Chris Albert. All right, but what I thought was interesting is that all this stuff did come out, that he was being sued, and there was a settlement. Now, if this case had no merit at all, now again, we don't know because sometimes there is nominal settlement value. So it's just, okay, let's just cut to the chase. We'll just sell this case for $1.50. Right now, there are times where the settlement is actually a lot of money, and you have to sign this confidentiality agreements. So we don't know for sure what happened in that case in the settlement agreement. All we know is that it was confidential. But still, the complaint is public record. That's not confidential. It's just the actual agreement, what the settlement was. And of course, in the settlement, there's always a provision that the settlement is not saying that either side is accepting liability and saying that they did anything wrong. So you can still stick to your story. And that's exactly what happened here. Sergeant Link was sticking to his story, his version of events about what happened here. So after all this, on redirect, or I should say I'm not sure if you want to call this direct or cross, but when the prosecutor got up, he said, well, isn't it true that you also investigated Tim Albert and charged Tim Albert with something? So here we have for Sergeant Link, you're trying to bring out the fact that he's so close with Chris Albert, and therefore he's the one conducting these interviews, and he's so biased, and he wants to always protect Chris Albert and the Albert family, and Brian Albert, by the way. And here you have him actually charging Tim Albert with a crime. So you see how honest Sergeant Link is, even to his friends and his friends' family. And that's true. He did charge Tim Albert. However, on recross, the defense attorney got up there and said, hold on a second. Let's talk about the case. Let's talk about that case where you charged Tim Albert, right? What happened in that case? Tim Albert smashed into somebody with his car and then fled the scene. Okay, it was a hit and run. And then where did he drive? He drove to 34 Fairview. Now, at the time, Sergeant Hank was investigating that crime, and he didn't even know who the person was. All he knew was that there was a hit and run. smashed into someone who was at a red light, by the way. So, and then took off. A classic hit and run. And he was able to follow the fluid from the car, the driver fluid from the car, all the way to 34 Fairview. And then he went in, and it was clear which car it was, the car that was smashed. And then, of course, he had no choice. So he was saying, you had no choice. It was very obvious what happened there. What are you going to say? Tim Albert didn't do anything wrong? And he said, even in that case, you just gave him a slap on the wrist, didn't you? So that part about Tim Albert is not going to be helping so much for Sergeant Lank if that comes out. So the judge is going to make a determination tomorrow about what exactly is allowed to come in. Certainly some parts are going to be allowed to come in, and we'll see then. But it was interesting to see at the end of the day today that all of this information was being brought in front of the judge, and the judge is eventually going to make the determination tonight and see what she's going to allow in, most likely tomorrow. I'm assuming that Sergeant Lank is going to be called tomorrow. So we'll see what happens then. All right. Well, that is the update from day 5. A very interesting day. Hopefully every day is going to be this interesting. Probably not. But it was a good day, a very interesting day in Karen Reed. Keep following. We will keep you updated. If you haven't yet, please like, subscribe, and we will see you next time.